Nigeria's August inflation increased by 40 basis points to 13.2% year-on-year in August from 12.8% in July. Once again, highest level seen since March of 2018. Look at the figures. This year-on-year, yeah, there it is, 13.2%. Look at food inflation, 16%. From August 2020, from 15.4 in July, core inflation at 10.5. So let's look at the month-on-month figures. Also saw some increases there as well. And joining us now to discuss these numbers is the CEO of CFG Advisory, Mr. Tilewa Adebajo. Good morning to you, Tilewa. What do you make of these numbers? This is inflation figures.
Good morning, Rotus. There are no surprises here. I think the trajectory on inflation has been upwards, and I think that's been something we've been monitoring for quite a while. You would notice that we had inflation at as high as 18.5% as a point in time, and it was brought down to about 11.5%. But since then, the policies have been such that is driving up inflation. And the key drivers of inflation, as you've mentioned, are the money supply, I think, which is higher at this point in time than the output in GDP. The national debt, which we're using 95% of our revenues now to service debt. The cost push effect, you're talking about food prices, transport, utilities. And now we're beginning to see the impact of now new fuel prices and the increase in electricity tariffs. And of course, you have the exchange rate. These four factors have been driving inflation upwards, and we will continue to see that trajectory. Although the central bank is predicting 14.5% inflation at the end of the year, from the numbers you're showing, we probably might hit that number by next month.
Thank you for that. That actually was my next question to you, because with all the factors you've laid in, and PMS now 159 now, and this is for this month of September, so probably won't see that pass-through effect until we look at inflation for this month, next month in October. So that's 14.5 or 14.15 figure from the central bank for December. That's, you would call it conservative, yes?
Not conservative. Maybe they need to review their projections because maybe they hadn't factored the increase in the electricity tariff. And of course, you talked about the increase in PMS. If we go by, even if we don't take a look at those effects and we go by the current run rate, at 13%, we'll see 5% increase. We'll look at maybe 18% by year end. So the challenge right now is to be able to keep that number away as close away from 20% as possible. If we're not careful, we could see 20% inflation by year end. And that is really where the challenge is.
Thank you for that. We just had massive floods in Kebbi, wiped out approximately about 25% of their output of rice. President was lamenting that, put a statement out through Garba Shehu, senior assistant on media and so on. And at this point, with regards to the reduction in supply of food, that being a driver, the border closure, it's been said that that's not going to be revisited and it's not going to be reopened, I guess because of the argument of smuggling. Is there any way around that? I mean, when you now talk about trying to temper down inflation.
Well, if you take a look at the four factors I've mentioned, that really has to do more with trade policy. The border closure has to do more with trade policy. And what you're saying is that probably if they start to import food, then maybe it might reduce the cost of food. But it's unfortunate because the key driver of inflation really is food inflation, which you mentioned was about 16%. Unfortunately, we need to tie this into the intervention that we're looking at with the central bank in terms of what they've done with all this money they pumped into rice production and sugar and all the other productions. We need to see what impact this is having. But unfortunately, when you have a flood and a natural disaster, as we've seen, then what tends to happen is that is more of it's more of a force majeure, which is an act of God. It's something you can't predict. And if that reduces the supply of food, we're just going to see more of a higher impact. And these floods, these late floods at this time of the year, when we should be talking about harvest, is also going to impact the inflation numbers, and I can only see the trajectory going upwards. So we need to separate the trade policy in terms of what happens with the border and what's going on with food inflation. Although they're interrelated, but the linkages are not quite clear.
Thank you for that, Tilewa. I want to ask you about return on investments for investors. I mean, inflation is galloping upwards. Meanwhile, the CBN just revised downwards savings rates to 1.25%. T-bills are doing, I think a 360 T-bill is doing like 3.4. Where does one go? I mean, that's a negative real rate of return. What options do Nigerians have at this point as investors and savers?
Well, I mean, you understand what's going on now, as you've said. Inflation is at 3.2%. Savings rate is at 1.2%. Those are negative rates of return in the economy. It's not surprising because if you add minus 6.5% growth, 50% unemployment, if you add underemployment to that, you have inflation, as you said, at 13.2%. You have 95% of government revenues going towards service debt and 65% drop in revenues of government. The environment we are in right now is called stagflation. It's a double jeopardy of high inflation growth and low economic or negative economic growth. So when we find ourselves in this situation, I think it's important to understand that we need to restore business confidence. We need to have a plan that we can sell to everybody that we're going in the right direction, that this whole, the negative rates might just be temporary, because the advantage to that is that there's still cheap sources of credit. And you're hoping that this, while you might have negative rates, don't forget at a point in time, investors were benefiting close to 18%. So there's an upside and there's a downside. And it's important that we manage this downside, and hopefully the cheap credit can create the stimulus that we need to grow the economy and restore us to normal. So these are very critical times when there's stagflation that we need to, the need for economic management and leadership now cannot be understated.
Thank you so much for that, Tilewa. The President Buhari just inaugurated a new committee, Medium-Term National Development Plan, MTNDP, supposed to succeed Vision 2020 and also succeed the Economic Recovery and Growth Plan, the ERGP, which both expire at the end of this year. President says that this new committee is part of his plan to lift 100 million people out of poverty. Tilewa, with these factors, with inflation rising, I mean, basically the stagflation scenario you've already painted, which we are in, how much of a challenge does that pose to this committee that the president is putting together in order to lift Nigerians out of poverty with these metrics that we're seeing?
Enormous amount of challenge because the government has been operating a fiscal deficit for the last 6 years. And what is also important to understand is that the Buhari administration only has 3 more years left. So it is important that this administration define what it's going to accomplish within the next 3 years. We're happy that they're setting out a long-term economic goal for Nigeria, but I think the priority at the moment should be how we can get out of this state of stagflation. Not only do we have stagflation, but we've had this issue with the economic depression and the COVID-19 impact on the economy. So while we look at long-term economic planning as a plus, it is important that our emphasis and focus should be on the last 3 years of this administration. The key signature projects, the second Niger Bridge, the Lagos-Ibadan Railway, ensure those projects are completed, and other infrastructure projects and projects that can create growth to be able to get us out of this scenario. And it's important that we see the leadership in the economy to be able to give us the necessary confidence for investors to come back and begin to invest and stimulate growth.
Fantastic. Now, I do want to follow up on something you just pointed out. The need for growth, but also our debts, right? About 95% of debt servicing, or rather 95% of revenues going to debt servicing. How much of a challenge is that with respect to trying to entice investors back here with what needs to be spent on infrastructure? How much of a weight is that debt, and how much does it impede us trying to get to where we need to get to?
Well, let me give you a scenario about the debt issue we're talking about. For instance, it is clear that the government alone cannot finance the infrastructure deficit. So what we have now is that it's important that we empower the ICRC. Concessioning of infrastructure, I think, is very important, because the government has to find a way to get private sector more involved in infrastructure financing, because clearly government does not have enough money. Then it is also important to take a look at projects. Take a look at the Abuja-Kaduna rail line, for instance. That was financed with money borrowed from China. So now, who is running that railway line? How much income has that railway line generated over the last 3 years? And how much of the income from that railway project is going towards servicing that specific debt? So it's important that we need to isolate a lot of our concessions and a lot of our debt financing to specific projects to ensure these projects are able to pay their loan back at least over the next 25 years. So now that government is using 95% of its revenues to service debt, there's no room for them to borrow anymore to finance any infrastructure project. So it's time for us to get the private sector involved in infrastructure financing. And if we put the right structure in place, empower the ICRC, the laws are there in place. You don't need any new laws. The agencies are there in place. It's just a question of starting that process. And I think that from what I have seen, we have close to 8 trillion naira in bankable projects that we can throw out there, starting with the airports. It shouldn't be quite difficult with that.
Thank you for that. Thanks for mentioning the airports. Do you agree with those that say the airports should be, you've mentioned the private sector now, completely privatized and not run by government at all?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, government can still own the infrastructure, which they do. But take a look at, for instance, if you have 1 million passengers going through an airport and you have each passenger paying $100, how much is that? You are raising close to, you can get revenues of close to 2 billion, 3 billion a year running an airport. And airport is an asset that is self-sustaining. At least the 3 major airports in Nigeria, Abuja, Lagos, and Port Harcourt, are viable airports. So let government focus the efforts on the less viable airports and ensure that the revenues from those airports are at least paying something. So without a doubt, I think it's important that we need to go to this direction because the government doesn't have the funds. We've been running a deficit for the last 6 years to finance not only recurrent expenditure, but, so where do you have money for capex?
Thank you, sir. And how does this constrict the next administration? You mentioned that the Buhari administration only has 3 more years to go. There's only so much they can do. They've been borrowing. Whoever comes into power next from 2023 onwards, are they locked or are they boxed in based on the debts raised by the prior administration with getting the country forward?
Definitely. So it's important that we understand what the funds were borrowed for. Like I've said, individual assets, the railway project, how profitable is that? We need to spin this off and concession it. So if you concession the railway project, then it's run by the private sector. Then every year they're delivering X amount of money, which can help you repay your debt. So in terms of capacity, you're talking about 18 trillion naira of debt borrowing over the last 6 years. And when this administration came, they had about 12 billion worth of debt on ground. So you can see how much of the debt profile has been increased, and we can see the consequences of that. And eventually that is holding down the economy. And of course, this is also causing inflation in the environment. So it's one of the 4 factors I mentioned that is putting pressure on inflation in the Nigerian economy today. So that is a problem the next administration will have to address. The debt issue is not going to go away over the next 2 years.
Tilewa Adebajo, CEO of CFG Advisory, thank you so much for taking us through those inflation numbers and giving us your solid analysis on what the government needs to do to get Nigeria growing again. Thank you so much. You're watching the Global Business Report here on the Rise News.